I'd like to welcome you to this recording. It's a recording of a talk, The West Midlands Slavery, the Black Presence and Anti-Slavery, 1700 to 1838. It's being given by Dr. Malcolm Dick, the chairman of the Black Country Society. It's a version of the talk that Malcolm originally gave at Bilston Town Hall to an face-to-face audience there on the 30th of April, 2025. But without any more ado, I'll simply hand over to Malcolm and let him deliver his talk. Malcolm, to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to everybody who's looking at this presentation. I'll explain the background to this. Like I think probably most people who are looking at this, the issue of slavery didn't appear in our history lessons at school. I studied economic history, I studied A-level history, and even at university, it was barely mentioned. And this would, of course, some decades ago. Things have changed a bit as there's been a greater recognition of how important the issue of slavery and migration, and indeed the anti-slavery movement, played in British history. And it's very difficult to underestimate its importance. What I'm going to do today is just provide an overview of the situation. I got interested in this set of subjects really when I was invited or was given an appointment as head of history at Rowley Regis Sixth Form College many decades ago. One of the courses I was asked to teach was a course in Afro-Caribbean Indian history and the Black Presence, and that was the new GCSE, which was peculiar to Sandwell, and it proved to be absolutely fascinating. It attracted a lot of students, and it led to me to read into the subject and research widely. And when I began working on history projects at Birmingham City Council, the issue of slavery, anti-slavery became ever more important. And it's something we addressed in the Revolutionary Players Project, which a number of you will have seen online. And then when I started to work at the University of Birmingham, I taught what appeared to be a very popular final year undergraduate course on this subject, not specific on the West Midlands, but looking at British history. So see this very much as an overview and as something where I'm pointing out there's a lot more work to do and a lot of debate to be had. The structure of my presentation is as follows. I'm going to look at some of the sources that are important. Just very briefly, this isn't an academic lecture or seminar, but I just want to point out a few things about what's available in terms of primary sources and secondary sources. I'm then going to look at the slave trade, slavery and sugar, which provides the main context. And then the Black Presence, how for many people the presence of slavery made an impact by showing the presence of slavery in the West Midlands from the early 18th century onwards, if not before. I'm going to look at industrial relationships in the West Midlands that help to underpin the connection with the slave trade in West Africa. The next major subject is to look at the beginning of abolitionism. It could be a huge subject in its own right. And then a few final points about the aftermath and some ways forward. As far as primary sources are concerned, newspapers are particularly valuable, especially now that they're available online, or very many of them are available online. There are also important business records. As far as the locality is concerned, the records of the Quaker Galton gun manufacturers were very important. That might seem to be a contradiction in terms. I don't think Quakers are supposed to make guns, but they were there anyway. And of course, the well-known firm of Bolton and Watt. Their archives are huge and extremely important. It's worth noting that the records of the vast majority of businesses, which were small and even some larger ones, do not survive. So often we're making sense of business connections, industrial connections with the slave trade, with very partial evidence or a few hints here and there. But we do get a number of insights from directories which list various firms, and sometimes these firms draw attention to the fact that they were involved in the African trade. There's also important family and personal records of the Lloyd family, the Erasmus Darwin papers and others. Church records are extremely important. Parish registers, Anglican parish registers provide an insight into burials, marriages, and christenings, and they tell us quite a lot sometimes about the black presence in particular localities. And then there are other institutional records like the Ladies Negro Friends Society, which is a really important West Midlands pressure group, which had Black Country links. One of the leading lights in that society was the wife of the Reverend Townsend in West Bromwich. So those are some of the key, not all, but key primary sources. I could provide an enormous list of secondary sources, but I'm just going to refer to a few. The starting point of this subject is really a classic work by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, which was first published in 1944. Eric Williams was an Oxford University historian who was from Trinidad, a member of the British Empire, if you like, who eventually became the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. But he had a distinguished early career as a historian. And I'll say a bit more about his work. To jump significantly by several years, and one of the most recent studies by two historians, Maxine Berg and Pat Hudson, is a very good overview, Slavery, Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. That's a pretty recent book. As far as the locality is concerned, if I can be more specific, there is a really good article in our own magazine, The Black Countryman, by W.A. Richards, Black Country Guns and the Slave Trade. For those of you who are members of the Black Country Society, you can access that online. Richards did a master's thesis at the University of Birmingham in the 1970s and wrote a number of other articles. And in a sense, he began the process whereby we can make connections between the Black Country and slavery and the slave trade. I'll mention some other online sources. I won't talk about these in detail, but those of you who've used the Revolutionary Players website, which I've mentioned before, you'll find there's some information there. It's a site I managed, and I made sure there's some material on slavery and anti-slavery. Then there are three links to material that Simon Briarcliffe has put online. And I would say that amongst recent historians, Simon, who works at the Black Country Living Museum, has done as much work as anyone in bringing this important subject into popular knowledge. So I recommend these three websites of Simon's for you to explore. Right, let us begin by exploring the context. When we're talking about the slave trade and anti-slavery, and indeed the black presence, we've got to begin with what was commonly called the triangular trade. And this was a trade route between Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. Three parts, as you can see. What happened is that ships from Europe, and there were a number of European countries that participated in the slave trade. The Portuguese, from the early 1400s, opened up European connections with Africa, followed by then the Spanish and the Dutch and the French and the English and the Danes and the Swedes and so on. So there's smaller countries involved as well on Atlantic states of Europe. And you can see the slave trade having these dimensions. So the Europeans sold manufactured goods that they had produced for slaves in West Africa. And this is where eventually the guns that I mentioned earlier came in. Slaves were purchased from African or Arab merchants or African kingdoms. It's very rare that the Europeans would enter the interior of Africa. They stayed on the edge in their forts, many of which still survive if people visit Ghana or Senegal. Some of the tourist attractions are the slave forts. And then these slaves were transported across the Atlantic in what were commonly seen as appalling conditions. It's called the Middle Passage. Could take 6 or 7 weeks if the weather was fair. It could take longer. And there was a very heavy death rate on the Middle Passage, as one can imagine. And there was an incentive on slave ship captains to cram as many slaves as they could into their ships because they knew there'd be a high death rate. And these slaves were then sold on the coast of South America, in the West Indies, or in North America for products that these countries produced. These could include precious woods, but importantly, the plantation economies of the Americas producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton were extremely important. The reason why the Europeans colonized these territories was really to establish economies which could then benefit the home markets. So the ships on the third journey, after selling the slaves, went back to Europe with the products on board, and these were then sold in Europe. So the ships were never empty. And there's been a lot of debate about how profitable the slave trade was, but certainly a lot of people in places like, take Britain's example, Bristol and Liverpool made a huge amount of money from their mercantile connections. So if I can pull out some of the issues here that underpin the triangular trade, the origins begin with Portugal. They brought black African slaves back to Europe. At one time, it was suggested that Lisbon, a third of its population, was black. Not all necessarily were slaves, but they were there. Spanish, French, and the Dutch were important, as I said. But by the late 17th, early 18th century, the most important slave trading state was Great Britain, or England and then Great Britain after the unification between Scotland and England. The reasons for that were multiple. First of all, was the enormous consumption of sugar in Britain. It's been estimated that in the 18th century, more sugar was consumed in Britain than in all the rest of Europe combined. So the origins of the British sweet tooth and our pouring of buckets of sugar into cups of tea and coffee and eating cakes and ruining our teeth is back to this enormous consumption of sugar. And because Britain was a particularly prosperous country, I know there were enormous divisions of wealth. But Britain had higher living standards than any other country in Europe on average, with the possible exception of Holland. So even members of what we might call the working classes could afford to purchase sugar. The other reasons, of course, was the growth of the British overseas empire, underpinned by the Royal Navy and also by British mercantile trade. And as many of you will know, there were a series of wars between Britain and European countries, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch, which, to all intents and purposes, led to Britain's preeminence on the seas. So the security of Britain's triangular trade was underpinned by the power of the Royal Navy. So the slave trade grew. I don't want to worry too much about numbers, but there has been a lot of discussion amongst historians about the number of slaves that were translated from Africa. One estimate, which is perhaps at the lower end, is 12 million. And that excludes those who actually died in the process or died while waiting in slave pens or being transported from the interior of Africa to the coast of West Africa in the meantime. There is a big debate about how important the slave trade was for the British economy. We know it was large. We know towns like Bristol and Liverpool in particular had their economies underpinned by the slave trade. But what is important really is to try and estimate how important this was for British economic life. And this is where I'm coming back to Eric Williams. Now, there's a few things I can say about Eric Williams's arguments. He questioned the traditional view that British humanitarianism led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in the British Empire between 1833 and 1838. The latter was a long and complex process. He argued that profits from the slave trade and plantation slavery underpinned Britain's Industrial Revolution. He also argued that Britain's slave economy declined after the American War of Independence in the 1780s, and this led to a breaking up of support for the slave trade and eventual abolition. And then a third argument that he produces is that the abolition of the slave trade and slavery was the result of economic self-interest and not as a result of humanitarian endeavor. He downplayed the role of people we've all heard of, like William Wilberforce. He didn't like Wilberforce very much. And he said, well, what was happening? The slave trade became less profitable. Slavery eventually became less profitable. It was to the benefit of British merchants, etc., to abolish the slave economy because it was costly and interfering with the gradual process towards free trade. Now, these are complex arguments that can't be answered very simply. These arguments, since Eric Williams's work has become widely known from the late 60s and 70s, have led to an enormous amount of debate and conferences that are held in his name, looking at arguments for and against. I don't think that anyone would argue now that the slave trade and plantation slavery weren't important in Britain's Industrial Revolution, and indeed in social life. The question is how important it is. one of the big problems is it's not really possible to measure it. Some historians have tried, but I think that's very difficult to do. I've mentioned that certainly Bristol and Liverpool were two ports that were heavily dependent upon slavery, upon the slave trade until 1807. Indeed, slavery thereafter, because Liverpool imported cotton from the United States. But we can see connections with industries that I'll pull out later. So historians now don't really believe that the slave economy declined after the American War of Independence. So that argument is underpinned. And as far as abolition is concerned, I think now historians see that as a very complex process. There were economic reasons, the rise of free trade. Adam Smith was a dedicated opponent of slavery in 1776 in his Wealth of Nations, both for economic and humanitarian reasons. But the humanitarian campaign, I would argue, was extremely important in mobilizing opinion here and putting pressure upon Parliament. Very, very powerful and sophisticated campaigns against both the slave trade and slavery. But also what was important was agency by black people themselves, which Williams didn't talk about, largely because I think these had not really come to the fore. But there were rebellions in many of the slave economies, which put pressure upon the imperial state, so to speak. But also there were campaigners themselves, and I'll draw attention to one or two of them later. Okay, let us start to move on and look at stronger connections with Britain, indeed the West Indies in particular. There are one quite dramatic pieces of evidence is the presence in newspapers of adverts for slave sales. And we have these for the West Midlands. The most important local newspaper for most of the 18th century and applied to what we call the Black Country now, as well as Birmingham and beyond, was Arris's Birmingham Gazette. And there are a couple of slave adverts, 3 slave adverts in Arris's Birmingham Gazette that I know of. And this is one of them, which has a particular Black Country connection. To be sold by auction on Saturday, the 30th day of November, at the house of Mrs. Webb in the city of Lichfield, and known by the sign of the Baker's Arms, between the hours of 3 and 5 in the evening of the said day, and subject to articles that will be there produced, except sold by private contract before at that time, of which notice will be given to the public by John Healy of Walsall, auctioneer and salesman. The Baker's Arms no longer exists, but there's a pub next to the Swan Hotel in Boar Street. So those of you who know Lichfield will know what is now a pedestrian and rather nice looking area with still a couple of former coaching inns on it. This was one. And a lot of commercial activities took place there. But the important thing really is what happens next. And that's where the advert draws attention to the individual who is to be sold. A Negro boy from Africa, supposed to be about 10 or 11 years of age. He is remarkably strong, well proportioned, speaks tolerable good English, of mild disposition, officious, and officious, which means efficient, sound, healthy, fond of labour. Doesn't mean he voted for Keir Starmer at the last election. And for colour, an excellent fine black. Now that tells us quite a lot, but it's also what's important is what these sources don't tell us. This is an incredibly young boy who was taken out of Africa, presumably is considerably younger than 10 or 11 years of age. We don't know if he spent some time in the West Indies or the Americas. The assumption is because it says a Negro boy from Africa, they may have come directly from there. Boys were very useful as slaves because they could be molded. They could be given new identities and new characters. And his physical characteristics are mentioned here. Speaks tolerable good English, so he had time to be acclimatized, if you suppose. He's he's got a mild disposition, friendly, etc., etc. So the assumption is from this advert they're going to sell him as a domestic slave, as a household slave. Lichfield, no doubt, was chosen as a venue because it was one of the richest towns in the Midlands. It's where the aristocracy had their watering houses as well. Many merchants and members of the gentry came to participate in cultural activities. Um, so we've got an important set of messages there. Also, that last point is worth noting, and for colour, an excellent fine black. One of the characteristics that was seen as desirable in slave sales was the darkness of the individual, particularly for domestic slaves. They would look attractive at dinner parties. And if you look at many paintings of aristocratic and gentry households in the 18th century, you will often see a young black slave or servant, male or female, and they provided a kind of color contrast. They're a status symbol, much like having a yellow Ferrari in your front drive. You're boasting to your friends and neighbors, look at me, I can afford a really nice black slave. Now, of course, what the advert doesn't say is important. Of course, this individual has no name. He's a slave. He has no identity under law. He's an object to be bought and sold. We don't know about the prehistory, how he got to Lichfield or Walsall. We don't know what happened to him afterwards. And this is the case with hundreds and hundreds of slave adverts in newspapers up and down the country. Of course, many slaves would be sold or exchanged without resort to auction or a public slave sale. But this is an example of what exists. And we do know there was a black presence in Lichfield. This isn't the only example. Some of you may have come across Francis Barber, who was Samuel Johnson's black slave and then black servant, to whom he left the bulk of his fortune. And eventually Barber set up a farm, bought a farm near Cannock, and his family still farm there now, descendants of him. So he's dehumanized this boy. No doubt he'd be given a new name by his fresh owners, and this was part of the way in which individuals were transformed. You could, with a changing of some of the words, have a horse here. So this is what slaves were. But
Okay.
I want to start now to look at the wider issue of slavery, the slave trade, and the black presence. I want to particularly look at the black presence to begin with, but I also want to look at some industrial connections, which I indicate here. I'll mainly be looking at some black country links. If we look specifically at the black presence, there's a number of insights that I want to provide from a wide range of different sources, and this is partial. One very important source is from a Swedish spy, Samuel Schroeder. Well, he was employed by the Swedish government, but the Swedes were very interested in what was happening in Britain, particularly in their iron and steel making capacity, because uh, England was seen as a competitor to Sweden. So Schroeder describes a visit in 1749 to Lloyd's slitting mill and corn mill in Birmingham, where he saw four men at work. Three of them were white and were paid from 15 to 18 pence a day, and one was a black slave who received only his food and clothing. Lloyd's were Quakers. They were the founders of the Lloyd's Bank, but at this time they weren't abolitionists. They did become abolitionists later. Parish registers are very important. One in Tipton refers in 1705 to John, an Ethiopian boy, page to the Lady Pye, who was baptized at St. Martin's in Tipton. And then we've got records of three men being baptized at St. Peter's, Wolverhampton. So they're noted and they're described as black individuals. If we're looking at some of these personalities, and I'll come back to Africanus, who was the last one mentioned there, who was baptized in Wolverhampton. Jane Harry, or Thresher as she became when she got married, and she was a free black, she wasn't a slave. She was born in Jamaica, the daughter of a judge, white judge, and a free black woman who was a descendant of black slaves. She was sent to England, was often the case of these people born out of wedlock, and to get an education. And amongst other things, she became an artist and was awarded a gold medal by the Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufacturing and Commerce. We don't know of any of her paintings that survive. She became a Quaker and served as a governess to the children of Sampson Lloyd in Birmingham between 1779 and 82. She was an active abolitionist, seemed to have a lot of confidence, and she married a Quaker surgeon. George Scipio Africanus has much more of a black country linkage. He was born in Africa in the early 1760s, don't know the exact date. And as a young boy, he was gifted to the ironmaster Benjamin Molyneux to live at his home as a domestic servant. That's Molyneux House in Wolverhampton, which is now Wolverhampton City Archives. Africanus was educated, baptized at St. Peter's as a young boy in 1767, and seems to have been treated reasonably well. He was apprenticed as a brass founder, and he became a man who could control his own destiny. He moved to Nottingham around 1784, where he married a white woman and founded a successful servants agency. He gained the right to vote and helped to organize the local watch and ward organization that was responsible for policing. We have a picture of him. Don't know whether it's absolutely accurate. Another individual who's extremely interesting is a guy called George Cousins. He was born in Jamaica in 1805 to a slave owner and an enslaved black woman, a mixed race individual. His father sent him to London for an education. There he joined the Primitive Methodists. Then he became a Baptist. He worked at Baptist churches in Aylesbury and Stourbridge and became minister at the New Connection Church in Cradley Heath in 1837. So far as we know, he was the first black pastor in Britain. He's not the only one. We know of others, but he appears to have been the first. Cousins was described as a mulatto, person of mixed race, mixed heritage, of strong emotions, of great eloquence, and a man of generous disposition. He became a pastor of other churches in Brierley Hill, Netherton, and Cradley Heath. He does appear to have been a celebrity, a local celebrity who was accorded a lot of status. Again, we have a picture of him. This is a photograph. Um, so there we see him in his clerical garb. Another individual is Henry Box Brown. He was born a slave in North Carolina around 1815. In 1850, he escaped and fled to England. There's an important story there, which is not relevant for our English connection, but is part of his fame in the United States. There in England, he became a publisher and ran financially successful anti-slavery performances and narrations supported by local ministers. In the Black Country, however, he faced opposition from the Wolverhampton Herald, who called him a bejeweled and oily Negro and semi-baboonish. Brown was forced to leave the Black Country, but sued the Herald for libel successfully. He continued to tour around Britain. So there's someone who was prepared and able to use the law because of the way in which his character had been defamed by a local newspaper. So you could get different kinds of success, if you like. People like Cousins, who was well supported locally, and then there are examples of someone not being treated so well. And that's an alleged picture of him. Again, it's a print. As far as industry was concerned, we've got a lot of information where we can make some connections. Of course, the Black Country, indeed the West Midlands generally, was important for producing a lot of small metal goods. The records of firms do not, in most cases, survive, except odd references, perhaps in directories. So Manila's chains and nails were used as part of the African trade and the wider triangular trade. Manilas were made out of brass. They were used as currency in Africa. They could also be used as bracelets. Better known in terms of linkages are the manufacture of guns and steam engines and the linkages there, as Simon Brycliffe does talk about the other industries. Just a few bits of information. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but the records of the Galton business exist in Birmingham archives, and Galton's was based in Birmingham, but the Galton family employed a very large number of outworkers making guns or assembling guns or making parts of guns in the Black Country. And we know a direct connection with Africa. And this is one list that shows the type of guns provided by the firm. Then it was called Farmer and Galton. It's a partnership. And as I say, you won't be able to read this, but different guns, different value were sent to different countries. You could see the Danes and the Spanish getting a lot. And a lot went to Portugal. And that was because of the colonies that Portugal was creating in Angola and Mozambique in Africa, and also in Brazil. They were already creating an African and American empire. Samuel Galton, this is Samuel Galton, the elder. He recommended to one of his contacts in the slave trade that he should contact Bolton and Watt about supplying steam engines to crush cane in Dawson's Sugar Works in Trinidad. We have this letter in the Bolton Watt archives. I won't read it through, but it shows an interest. Bolton Watt the elder, did not supply steam engines to the Caribbean, but James Watt Jr., when he took over the company from about 1800 onwards, did. And we have in the records diagrams of a cane crushing machine here operated by a slave. This is a representation of what a steam engine might have looked like in the West Indies. And the historian Jennifer Tan has looked at these records and discovered really that the steam engine business from the 1810s up to the 1830s substantially underpinned Bolton and Watt's firm, under their sons, and was the main reason for their financial success. Enormous number of steam engines, hundreds of steam engines were supplied to the West Indies mainly to crush cane. If we move on to abolitionism, this is a big topic, complex topic. How do we explain it? One difficult thing that historians have found not easy to explain. Why did an anti-slavery movement emerge in Britain when Britain was clearly making a lot of money out of the slave trade and slavery, although it's difficult to know how much. And also there's the issue of the motives. And of course, there would be religious reasons, economic reasons, humanitarian reasons to do with the Enlightenment. Some historians say the growth of a leisured and, for want of a better phrase, liberal middle class was substantially responsible, who were interested in social progress and different causes. There might be animal welfare, it might be prisoners' welfare, it might be the welfare of slaves. We know about key individuals. Wilberforce, I've mentioned before, he had Birmingham connections, although he came from Yorkshire. He married the daughter of a Birmingham banker. Granville Sharp was an important campaigner, as was Thomas Clarkson. Josiah Wedgwood, a bit more about Wedgwood, has a Midland connection, and Priestley, and indeed a black individual, Olaudah Equiano. There was also, in the 19th century, Joseph Sturge. And then various societies were formed locally, or indeed nationally, where local people like Wedgwood played an important part. And I've mentioned the Ladies Negro Friends Society, or the Female Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves, or Black Slaves as it was sometimes called. It changed its name. Josiah Wedgwood, based in Stoke-on-Trent, was a campaigner against the slave trade and slavery. And he produced, and this is a print, he produced a ceramic medallion, which was distributed free at anti-slavery meetings, which had the image of a Negro slave, black slave, and am I not a man and a brother? And there was a female version of this with a woman on it. It's an image that was very powerful. It's a very simple and powerful image with the begging black slave. But of course, it's been criticized. It seems to suggest the black slaves could only get freedom by begging or praying for it. It sort of minimizes the role of black agency, but we'll rectify that a little bit earlier. But I don't want to minimize, a little bit later, but I don't want to minimize the importance of that image as a powerful rallying cry for many people. It was reproduced in books, became part of women's jewelry, produced on snuff boxes, became badges. Very important. Joseph Priestley, best known as a chemist, but he was also an extreme political radical, great believer in reducing the power of the Anglican Church and the aristocracy over political affairs. But in our context, when he was a Unitarian minister in Birmingham, he seems to have been crucial in beginning the local campaign. He gave a sermon on the subject of the slave trade in 1788. And this sermon, which is available online if you look for it, it's quite a remarkable document. It's not a terribly long one, quite common to publish sermons at this time, where he brings forth a whole range of arguments against slavery and against the slave trade. He regarded slavery as the greatest sort of evil in the world. And this is just one of the things he said that perhaps marks him out as distinctive. You will consider all mankind as brethren and neighbours, as men and as Christians. We should not rest ourselves, not only for our relations or friends, not only for our countrymen, not only for Europeans, but for the different inhabitants of Asia, Africa, or America, and not only for Christians, but for Jews, Mohammedans, and infidels. And as we ought to feel for our fellow men, we ought to the utmost extent of our influence to exert ourselves to relieve their distresses. There he's emphasizing the commonality of human experience, that he believes we should not discriminate because of people's origins or religion. If they're distressed, then they ought to be relieved. And slavery was one thing that he regarded should be tackled. Another figure was Erasmus Darwin, Lichfield based. Darwin, one of the most highly educated people in Britain, a medical doctor, grandfather of Charles Darwin, and first mention in his archives is a correspondence that he had with Josiah Wedgwood. And he wrote, "I've just heard that there are muzzles or gags," this is 1789, "made in Birmingham for the slaves in our islands. If this be true, and such an instrument could be exhibited by a speaker in the House of Commons, it might have a great effect." By Birmingham, read the West Midlands. So, of course, a wide range of metal goods were produced. So, he may well have heard this from Thomas Clarkson, who publicized these tools that were used to control slaves. Another figure was Olaudah Equiano. He's a quite a remarkable figure, a black slave, became essentially for most of his life a domestic slave. He seems to have been well treated and educated, and eventually bought his freedom. Slaves could earn separate money if they were extremely lucky to be able to do so. And in England, he became a successful businessman, running an import-export business. He also wrote an autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, which became a bestseller. It is an interesting book to read. It tells us a lot about his origins, his religious feelings, his activities. And I mentioned Equiano, or Vasa, which was his Christian name, christened after a Swedish king that liberated Sweden from Denmark. So how ironic is that? But Equiano was quite proud of both his African and his European or Christian heritage. That's an image of him. He's got the Bible open with the Acts of the Apostles, um, page for the Acts of the Apostles there. Equiano was adept at selling his books. He went on campaigns up and down Britain, holding meetings and being supported by many local people. For example, in Birmingham, he especially thanks Charles and Sampson Lloyd. I assume he was staying with them. And of course, the Lloyds were then active um, campaigners against slavery. But the list lists a whole series of other people. Samuel Galton, surprisingly, is there. Um, Reverend Priestley was there, less surprisingly. Matthew Bolton is there. So if you've got people who are the great and the good across Birmingham and the West Midlands, who must have attended a dinner or must have purchased his book. We do know that the book became a bestseller. It was pirated and translated and sold in other countries and went through several editions here. Darwin continued his campaigns, perhaps not as active as Priestley or Wedgwood, but he wrote poetry. I won't worry about reading that. You can read that for yourselves, where he was passionate about seeing the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. And then we've got other individuals. Mary Ann Galton, the daughter of Samuel Galton Jr., member of the Lunar Society, produced an autobiography which was partially sort of ghost written by Christiana Hankin. She married a Dutchman, hence the name Schimmelpenninck. And interestingly, she became an active member of the Ladies Negro Friends Society. As a young girl in the 1790s, she describes an experience that she had. My father had a very large acquaintance with the affluent West India merchants of Liverpool who sold his guns. They were most kindly, generous, and hospitable. Their houses were like palaces. I was amazed to see the sumptuous drawing rooms, rich with satin and silk, in houses where there was no library. In other words, they were not educated. But what surprised me most was the multitude of black servants, almost all of whom had originally been slaves. This deeply moved my compassion, and when I saw the table laden with West India produce in its various forms of fruit and sweetmeats, and saw the black servants looking on at the produce of a land, their native home, which they had left for us and which they might take, my heart often ached. And she agreed not to consume West Indian sugar. I sometimes speculate what breakfast times must have been like when they were eating their Quaker oats, and she refused the sugar passed on by her father. But in any case, she's an example of what we can call the anti-saccharist campaign, the opposition to consuming West Indian sugar to put pressure on the on the slave trade. We know about organizations. There's a lot I could say about this organization. Very well supported, and you can see it's a female society for the relief of British Negro slaves, Birmingham, West Bromwich, Wednesbury, Walsall, and their respective neighbourhoods, cross region. A later campaigner who was based locally was Joseph Sturge, another Quaker, active in Bewdley and then in Birmingham. He became a promoter of political reform, world peace, support of Chartism, and he was particularly active locally and nationally in opposing what was called the apprenticeship system after 1833, when British Parliament passed the Abolition of Slavery Act, it didn't abolish slavery immediately, so that most slaves, not all of them, but most, would have to serve an apprenticeship before they became free finally after 7 years in 1840. But the apprentice system was something that was widely abused. And through campaigning and publishing books, which were based upon his visits to the West Indies, he helped secure the abolition of slavery. And he was very active in the wider anti-slavery campaign. When the abolition of slavery was brought forward to 1838, as opposed to 1840, he campaigned against slavery elsewhere. And we have a memorial to Joseph Sturge in Birmingham. This is a statue in Five Ways, just outside the Marriott Hotel. Now, to finish off very quickly, key events, as I've said before, were the abolition of the slave trade and then the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. It's interesting to look at the campaigns that led to these sets of events. I haven't dealt with that today. That's for another day. But we also know about compensation that was paid to slave owners, and a huge sum of money, equivalent to the third of Britain's GDP, was given to those who had an economic interest in slave owning, either through investments or owning slave plantations. Locally, in the Black Country, the Earls of Dudley gained a substantial amount, but weren't the only ones. The sum of money was huge. It took into the 20th century before the amount borrowed to pay for this was paid back. Slaves, of course, did not get any compensation for being slaves. Slave owners did, because in British law, until 1833, 1838, slaves were property, and you couldn't take, in British law, property away from people without compensation. And then West Midlands continued as an abolitionist area, mainly by people campaigning against American slavery, and it provided the home for abolitionists, including the black former slave Frederick Douglass, who visited England, including the West Midlands, on several occasions. And where do we go from now? Well, there's still an enormous amount of work to do. Establishing clearly what happened and when, the chronology. Mapping links with metal industries. Looking more closely at the retail and consumption of sugar. Looking rather more strongly at connections between the aristocracy, gentry and clergy and the slave trade and slavery. And indeed, abolitionism. The basis of abolitionist sentiment, motives, needs a lot of unpicking there. But the growth of abolitionist sentiment is certainly a phenomenon that you can map in the West Midlands and indeed elsewhere from the 1780s onwards. Cross alliances. People grouped together to support abolition. Priestley recorded that the only occasion he could work with Anglicans was on supporting the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. Couldn't work with them on other occasions. How abolition was transmitted through communications, through petitions, print, poetry, mass meetings. And a lot more can be done there. The pressure that built up. And there's more work that can be done on the Black presence. Often it's a question of finding out who these people were and what happened to them. And that's gradually being done. I mentioned Francis Barber, and we know that he established a family that still exists in the Cannock area. I'll leave that there, ladies and gentlemen, so thank you very much indeed. Okay, Chris.
Okay. Well, thank you, Malcolm. To those of you who are listening, obviously you can't give questions directly. But if you'd like to leave questions in the comments to the YouTube or contact the Backcountry Society at the normal email address, then we'll try and make every effort to answer any questions you might have. But thank you again for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.